Futurism is the view that the events of what the Bible calls the last days, or as some call it, the end times, are all in our future. And if you want to be called a Christian and don't want to be thought of as a heretic or a false prophet, it is essential you adhere to the futurist eschatology. But with the end times experts making different predictions multiple times a year, and the multiple verses in the Bible you'll come across saying that the events of the last days would happen soon, near, shortly, we can start having a lot of doubts about these things happening in our future and start to think that maybe Jesus and the apostles actually meant what they said, which is of course preposterous. That's why I've developed these 5 keys to hold fast to your futurist eschatology no matter what sound biblical evidence for a past fulfillment slaps you across the face. Key number 1 is don't study the Bible for yourself. Because much of futurism was predominantly thought of by one man inspired by a dream a random girl in the United Kingdom had, this is a sure sign we don't need to study it any further for ourselves to check and make sure it's true. Besides, everyone knows studying scripture for yourselves is how cults are started. There would be far less cults in the world if more people would just listen to whatever someone else tells them rather than trying to study for themselves. Key number 2 is ignore the numerous time statements in the Bible. The New Testament has a ridiculous amount of statements saying that the events of the last days were going to happen soon, near, take place shortly, or at hand, or about to take place. So you need to provide a good reason for ignoring these scriptures if you want to hold fast to your futurist eschatology. How do you do this? Just say 1,000 years is like a day to the Lord and a day like 1,000 years. Even though a well-established rule of biblical interpretation is that the few verses should be interpreted in light of what the majority of scripture says, ignoring this rule completely and quoting this verse out of context in this way magically makes all the time statements suddenly mean nothing. Using this verse for yourself is also very handy if you're getting out of unwanted predicaments, being late for work, being late for church, skipping a party you really don't want to go to. Here's a situation where it helped me recently.
Hey honey, can you change the baby's diaper? I'm trying to clean the kitchen.
I will soon, honey.
Hey, have you changed the baby's diaper yet?
Not yet.
Can you do it now?
I'm about to.
Honey, have you changed the baby's diaper?
The time is near.
Honey, why didn't you change the baby's diaper? You said over and over again you were going to do it soon.
1,000 years is like a day to me, and a day like 1,000 years.
What? Why don't you just communicate clearly and say what you mean?
My ways are higher than yours. Does this make one sound manipulative, dishonest, confusing, and untrustworthy? Doesn't matter. It's what Jesus does. So by you making confusing statements to manipulate people and play with their minds, you're actually being like Jesus. Number 3 is ignore audience relevance. When Paul, Peter, or John say at the beginning of their letters things like, to the church of Ephesus, or to the church of Corinth, thinking that they're actually writing to those Christians back then can be dangerous to holding on to your futurist eschatology. Because the New Testament authors specifically say that the Christians back then were eagerly waiting and would see the coming of the Lord. They would not all die before the resurrection happened. So when we read these letters, it is essential we realize that Paul, Peter, and John are mistaken and are actually talking to you and I. How do we know this? This is how we should read all letters. Whenever you hold a letter in your hand, it automatically becomes addressed to you, no matter who the letter says it's addressed to.
Aw, my grandma wrote me a letter.
Let me see that. She's writing to me. Sometimes if I'm lonely, I'll steal other people's letters because I know when I start reading the letter, it automatically becomes addressed to me. Then I'll feel more loved because of all the people that write me letters. I found I get a lot more birthday cards than I used to. I also found I have a lot more birthdays than I remember. The extra birthday money is really nice though. This is why when the New Testament authors say things like, you who are eagerly waiting for the Lord's return in 1 Corinthians 1:7, and those of us who are alive and remain at the resurrection in 1 Thessalonians 4:17, and we will not all sleep in 1 Corinthians 15:51, I know they're actually speaking to me here and now, even though the authors specifically say in their letters that they're writing to the Christians in the first century. Key number 4 is to take all the metaphors as literal. The Old Testament is riddled with idioms and metaphors, and these same idioms and metaphors are used in the New Testament. Metaphors like the Lord coming on a cloud, representing the Lord bringing an army to destroy a city or another army, or heaven and earth burning up, the sun, moon and stars going dark and not giving their light, which represented a governing system and the leaders under that system being destroyed or taken captive. These same metaphors are used in the New Testament when speaking of the events of the last days. But you want to completely ignore this and take these obvious metaphors as absolutely literal. Otherwise, there'd be strong evidence that these last days events are speaking of the Roman army coming and destroying Jerusalem, the temple system, and all the rulers under that system in AD 70. It doesn't make sense that the last days are speaking of the last days of the temple in the Old Covenant system, because it specifically says in Genesis 8:21 that God would never again curse the ground and destroy all living things. And in Ecclesiastes 1:4 it says that the earth will remain forever. So that definitely means there has to be a day when Jesus destroys the whole planet. So instead of checking what these words and terms describing the last days events mean in the Old Testament, take them all as literal. And then you can just say, it hasn't happened yet, so it must be in our future. Just to be safe, it's probably better just to take all metaphors and idioms literally, just so you can say you're being consistent.
It's raining cats and dogs out there.
I don't see any cats and dogs. Hasn't happened yet. Maybe in 2,000 years. Using this approach means now when someone suggests that the last days ended in the 1st century, you can shoot down their rational conclusion by just telling them all the things that haven't happened according to how you've poorly interpreted scripture to say they would happen. Key number 5 is to appeal to the creeds and the early church fathers' writings. When anyone even hints at suggesting that Jesus did what he plainly and repeatedly said he would do and returned soon from when the New Testament was written, shoot them down by appealing to the creeds and early church fathers. Even though the popular views of the Western Christian Church disagree with much of what the creeds and early church fathers say, because we do agree with the parts of the creeds that say there's still a future physical resurrection and physical return of Jesus, that makes that part of the creeds absolutely true. And if that part of the creeds is absolutely true, then anyone who disagrees is definitely a heretic and a false prophet for disagreeing with the creeds. Besides, everyone knows that as time has gone by, mankind has gotten less knowledgeable, not more knowledgeable. Think of things like medicine and technology. We've only gone backwards with these things, not forwards. Man, I wish we had the technology they had 2,000 years ago. They knew so much more back then. Hey Siri, can you find me a good restaurant nearby?
Okay, Master Bruce. Here's what I found.
And since we know we are far less knowledgeable in technology, education, linguistics, mechanical engineering, rocket science, medicine, and everything else, we can definitely be sure we know far less about biblical interpretation than the early church fathers did, not more. That's why we should trust whatever the creeds and early church fathers' interpretation of the Bible was, and not try to interpret for ourselves. Well, that is, except for the parts of the creeds my church denomination disagrees with. They definitely had those parts wrong. If someone presents to you the idea that the last days were fulfilled in the 1st century, and using the 5 keys I've mentioned isn't working, just say something like, "So what now? Are you saying this is all there is?" This will immediately shut them down and make any valid biblical argument they've made meaningless. Because everyone knows that believing Jesus will come back one day and slaughter over half the world's population provides far more purpose and meaning to our lives than a relationship with the creator of the universe. I'm Micah Stevens. God bless. Thanks for watching.